I know.
So
Yeah, this is the time to come. It's not
yeah,
over 100 degrees.
yeah. We just finished our trip. I haven't had sleep in the last 3 days because we had 2 transports this weekend. But we finished our last. Got delivered to Minnesota. Over almost 1,100 cats and dogs we got out this year through that coalition that we put together.
Wow.
And between ours two and one of our coalition members that also got a chance to send 90 animals to Michigan, we got 167 out total just this weekend alone.
Wow.
So
That's
I'm
cool.
Congrats.
I'm
You've been
tired.
busy.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
That's a lot
So
of work.
All right. Let's get the call started. Sorry to interrupt you, June. I just want to start
oh
on
no,
time since they just started recording. But welcome everybody to our Monday community conversation call. My name is Jose Ocaño. I will be co-hosting this with my good friend Claire Carlson. And I'm really looking forward to our topic today, negotiating fair compensation. We have two dynamic speakers who you're going to hear about. And so I think that talking about pay and how we can advocate for better pay for our team members is really fundamental in terms of employee engagement and making sure that people have, their basic needs met so that they can do their very best work. So I'm excited to hear about how we can do that a little more effectively. And before we dive into our presentation, we have a few things we want to cover. And so the first one is the question of the day, which we like to start with. And that is for organizations who are municipalities, government funded shelters. I think I might know the answer to this, but I still want to see your answers in the chat. Do you think that you are adequately funded? So, and feel free to also put in the chat your name and where you're from too. If this is your first time attending the call, we love to build community on these calls. This is a great opportunity to network with folks. And maybe there's someone who's in your county, in your state, in your adjoining kind of your state buddies. So always use this as an opportunity to connect with someone else. But Claire, you work with a lot of organizations. Have you met any of them that have said, yeah, we got everything we need to do the work?
I know. I think that the chat is speaking for itself. I'm getting a lot of resounding no's and nevers. But yeah, that's reflective of what we're seeing as well. And it's interesting because, especially this year, space and resources have definitely been taxed. And it's easy to point to a thought that it's overpopulation or lack of kennel space. But a lot of times it's lack of funding to build programs and to have enough staff and the bandwidth to get everything done. So yeah, it's a huge issue that I feel we've been doing a lot of like band-aid solutions, but yeah, shelters are certainly underfunded from what we're seeing.
Yep. And I think that you're right. The chat is confirming a lot of this, which is why this is so great that we have our two guest speakers here today, because the information you're going to learn today can perhaps help bridge some of these gaps. May we get everything we want? I don't know. But can we make improvements? That's always what I'm after, progress, not necessarily perfection. So with that, Claire, I'll hand it over to you. I think we're going to maybe do some national updates.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to see everyone here. I know the holidays are fast approaching. And just a reminder that we're going to have a break for the next 2 Mondays. So our next call will be January 8th. So that being said, for any national organizations, if you have any announcements, if you want to unmute, we'll start that now. And feel free also to use the chat.
Actually, Allison here from Maddie's Fund. And we have a webcast coming up this Thursday that I think everybody here might be interested in attending. It's an Ask the Expert, Keeping Tenants and Their Pets Together with Diana Prado. So I will put the link in the chat, but it's come with your questions all about housing rights and eviction processes and how to help a person remain housed with their pet. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. And for anyone who has not had the pleasure of meeting Diana Prado, I would say you need to go to this because she is dynamic. It's going to be a comedy show mixed with legal. Let me just tell you that. She's really, really great and engaging in how she delivers information. So I recommend that. I'll give an update. So part of what I do is with my company, Hatching, is we host these monthly hatching hours where we bring on different guests to talk about different topics. So this week on Thursday, we're going to be having a woman named Maddie, and she's going to be talking about deep listening and how to build the capacity to really listen to ourselves and others. And I've been doing a deep listening course with her, and it's changing my life. It's changing how I relate to myself, how I relate to others, and it's setting the foundation for how I operate, show up, make decisions. So I'll put the link to the Zoom in the chat. If you're not, it's this Thursday. If you're not able to attend, I would say register so you can get the recording. But if you're someone who's interested in deepening your connection to yourself and others as a means of being more effective and impactful, then this is probably a great opportunity for you. Any other national updates?
Yeah, I'll jump on. Hi, I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson from Maddie's Fund, and want to let everybody know that on Thursday, January 11th at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern, we'll be having our next Maddie's Insights webcast. And for January, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Laura Reese, who's going to be talking about foster care and the human-animal bond and some of the emotional aspects of foster caregiving and ways to help retain our foster caregivers. So I will put a link to that in the chat. Thank you.
Awesome.
Claire, could you mention, or Jose, about Zoom?
Of course, yeah. Allison just put in the chat, just a reminder going into the new year. Make sure that you update your Zoom. Sometimes it can do funny things if you don't have the updated version or not allow you to join calls. So go ahead, it just takes a couple seconds. Make sure your Zoom is the most updated version just before we get into the new year.
Yes, I need to do that myself.
Yes, same. It's a good reminder.
All right, so if we don't have any other national updates, if you have one, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm really excited to hand this over to our two dynamic presenters, Kate and Katie. And I'll actually let each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are and their organization that they represent. And then from there, they'll start their presentation. So why don't we start with you, Kate, and then Katie.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Meghji, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Humane Rescue Alliance in Washington, D.C. I've only been here for a few months, and prior to that, for the last 10 years, I led 2 different nonprofit animal shelters with municipal housing contracts. I've been in the animal welfare field for almost 20 years, and this is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about because I'm a nerd. And that's about it.
I love it. All right, and Katie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Barnett. I am an attorney in Kansas and Missouri. My office is in Kansas, and we have a practice that is solely dedicated to animal law. We are the only practice in the state of Kansas that is dedicated to animal law, and there are a couple other attorneys in Missouri who are, but our primary focus and the majority of our clients are animal shelters. So we've been doing this for over a decade now, and we have some really great information to present to you all here today. Is it okay if I share my screen so we can start our presentation?
Absolutely.
Yes, please do.
Okay. All good? Can everyone see okay? Okay,
Yes.
great. And I'll just need to make sure I can advance this slide. There we go. So Kate and Katie, we gave our introductions, but Kate and I have known each other for quite some time. We work together, and those are our daughters, who my daughter, the curly-haired one, is now 7. So that's how that's how long this relationship has gone on for the two of us. And our bios are there. I just also add that I do also do a lot of law enforcement training with regard to animals. And then I also do special prosecution work for animal cases that come through that are complex animal cases or felony level cases. And so that is us. And I think that we'll have some contact information at the end of the presentation. So today we're just going to go over asking for change, educating city officials, and knowing your worth, because it sounds like from the chat that you all know your worth. You know that you are underfunded, underpaid. I think that we would all love to give our staff the money that they deserve. And so that is what we want to talk about here today. So asking for change. There are so many different ways to for change to come about. And what prompts change, what prompts this conversation with a municipality or with the city in which your municipal organization, or in which your organization is a division of. So not all of you, I assume, are private shelters with municipal contracts. I assume some of you are just a division of your municipality or your county government. But what prompts this conversation is really important to kind of how you handle it. So oftentimes it's moving shelter operations from public to private. Your local government is saying, hey, this is no longer sustainable for us. Usually there's some public outrage over some things that have been happening. And so then you can come in and you get to come in and perhaps save the day. And then there may be an RFP for new shelter operations. Perhaps the current animal organization or rescue that has the contract is disbanding or dissolving, or you know, they're just not adequately staffed and they're not meeting their performance under the current contract. So your city will put out a new RFP or request for proposal, in which you submit a bid response to take over that animal shelter's work. There may be budget changes either from the city or local government or from you, and you need to have this conversation. I have a client who is saying, hey, you know, we're doing a lot of outreach activities now and our budget is getting bigger and you are trying to cut our budget by $100,000. You know, we need to have a little conversation of the meeting of the minds here. And so that may be a reason for this discussion. Or what we usually see is that your contract term is up, or you want a renewal of a current agreement. And then that's where you have this conversation about money. Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
I love it when the contract term is up. That's my favorite time of the cycle.
The most wonderful time of the year. Yes.
Yes.
That's when you get to, I would agree with you. That's when you don't have a lot of educating to do. Sometimes you do, which we'll talk about later, but it's a lot of saying, hey, this is the data that we've gathered. This is what we've been doing for you over the last several years. This is how things have changed. And this is why we want more money. There are two really great things about that. After you've been doing it for a while, nobody wants to take it back. Your city, it is unlikely that your city wants to find a new shelter, absorb the costs of transitioning back back to municipal service. And so you have a lot of negotiating power there, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, and I'm kind of heavy on this side and then the end, and Kate will talk you through the middle. So understanding how budgets work. I find it less that my clients need to understand how budgets work and more that we need to educate our city officials on how budgets work, because they have their city budget and they look at your budget, or they might even not look at your budget and they may say, well, how much could it possibly cost to feed and water an animal? They don't take into account everything else that comes with it. And so, you know, you don't tell them that you need more money. You talk about how your services are enhanced now and you need to offset that. Your services are enhanced because you're getting, you know, who knows, more owner surrenders. You're getting more over-the-counter strays from the public because animal control is understaffed. You are doing more outreach services. And so you have to explain that to them, because oftentimes cities just think that you take in animals and you get these awesome results with all the puppies and kittens you adopt. They don't understand what you do. And so sitting down, finding a time to sit down with them and talk to them about what exactly it is that you do, all of the services that you offer, can really bolster your negotiating power. And then talking about the value of the service. It's not that you do intake diversion, or it's not that you provide community resources like, spay neuter. That's not how you want to phrase that. And I'm sure most of you on this call know that. It's not that we provide spay neuter. It's not that we provide resources for people to keep their pets. Is that we prevent the intake of animals that you, city, have to pay for, depending on what your agreement is. And so you have to explain to them that these enhanced services are reducing intake. And by reducing intake, we're reducing the potential growth and need of additional funding from the city. That's a really great negotiation tactic when they're trying to cut your funding. And then, and then always saying, hey, do you want, if we stop providing these services, you're just going to have a bunch of animals running at large. So there are 3 contract models that we're going to go over today. One is per animal. I'm sure you all are very familiar with these, but just in case you are not, one contract model is per animal, which means, just a flat rate per animal that comes in. You just have your little clicker and tally up how many animals come in from that jurisdiction. Generally, we see those in lower intake areas. Like if you have a primary client and then you have a bunch of rural or suburban cities or towns that bring in animals, then you may have a per animal model. Also, there's the per capita model, which is based on, it's a dollar amount that's based on the amount of people, the population of your community that you're serving. And then there's the flat rate model, which essentially says, this is how much it costs to run our animal shelter. X percentage of animals come in from your jurisdiction. And so this is the percentage that you owe us. So per animal, like we talked about, this is really traditional funding. It's pretty problematic when you start talking about like how much it actually costs to care for animals. And again, this does not cover additional services. It never fully covers cost of care. It doesn't cover additional services that you provide, like intake diversion. There's no dollar amount being put toward the effort that you are spending in resources you are expending, in staff time you're expending, like admin time, in essentially ensuring that no animals come in, which prevents you from getting more money from the city. So it is just tedious and burdensome administratively. And like I said, it's generally seen with lower intake numbers. Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't.
Okay. And generally that's kind of the language that you see. Honestly, Kate and I both, we cannot stand this model. It's not a great model for any animal shelter. But it's the one that's the simplest for municipalities or local governments to understand and to put a dollar amount to. It's the easiest, but oftentimes the easiest to understand is not the most beneficial to the community. Okay, Kate, here's where you shine.
This is me. So we create some models of what different communities look like and how different funding structures can benefit or hamper them. So we've got Dogville, which is a smaller community. It takes in relatively few animals and has a live release rate of 76%. Oh no, my chat's popping up. So for Dogville, they get $100 per intake, which comes in at about $200,000 per year. to operate a shelter that takes in 2,000 animals a year costs roughly $1.5 million. So only 13% of the funding that's given by the community to the shelter is funding it. When you look at Cat City, it's a much larger population. You're getting fewer dollars per animal, and you're still really funding just a small percentage of the work that you do. So what that means is that these shelters can really only do very traditional animal sheltering services, low surrender prevention, low RTO, and no public services. So then the next slide is, so what Katie said about the flat rate fee is that's what there. So, or the flat rate fee is something that I actually really like. And at my last shelter, we did transition from a per animal fee to a flat rate fee. And it's becoming more common, especially for sort of these medium-sized to larger shelters. And the way that I view it is that you are a vendor who is providing a service that is likely required by some type of state statute or other local ordinance for this municipality to sign. So my view on this is we are a vendor who provides the service. I'm going to tell you what it's going to cost, and you have to decide if you want me to play, if you want to pay me this amount. And when I'm doing the research around calculating what that flat rate needs to look like, I definitely look at per capita and annual intake numbers, as well as where they're coming from. The first time you do this, it's a big sticker shock, because it goes from $75 per cat to, which is let's say $200,000 a year. Now it's up to $850,000 a year, and the municipality has a heart attack. So what we would typically do is kind of budget in, a multi-year contract with increases over time to start to even the playing field. They can be challenging to negotiate. For the per animal model, what you can do it a couple of different ways. Like you could say, okay, it costs me let's say $1 million a year to run my animal shelter that takes in X number of animals, and just divide it by the number of animals so that you include your overhead and administration. What people typically end up doing, which I don't necessarily recommend, is, look at the number of animals and then add up the cost of vaccines, and you add up all of the little things that you think you do and estimate the amount of food and the length of stay, and then you round that number down because you don't want the county to say no to you. So that's kind of what we want to avoid.
Yeah, and I would add that also there are some pitfalls to this, because for the local government, they're saying, okay, we know this is what it costs every year, year after year. And so they just budget in that amount. And every year you are, for the last decade, you've been like, okay, this sounds good. We're still able to make ends meet. We do have to fundraise a little bit more. Our costs are going up. In what other kind of contract, like a construction contract, we talk about the increased cost of goods. We talk about all of the increased costs that are coming up, and animal sheltering is no different. They have to take that information into account. And so when you're negotiating it, you want to say, okay, I'll do 3 years, but then we need to step back and say, let's look at this again and renegotiate it in 3 years. Because that's when you say, hey, things have gone up a little bit. Our budget is a little bit higher this year. Looks like, the animals coming in from your jurisdiction, we took in X number of animals last year. We're taking in, 15% more this year, or we're estimated to take in 15% more this year. That number is only going to grow with the housing issues that are going on in our community. And so you really want to talk about like what else you're seeing in your community and what your intake numbers are showing, to explain it, as well as the cost of resources and everything that's going on. The other thing that I found to be very helpful in negotiating is you want to be able to pay a living wage to your staff. You don't want the city, and not in a threatening way, but you don't want it to be known that your shelter is not paying a living wage, and that the city doesn't want to be known as a local government that's not helping subsidize a living wage to your shelter workers. And so that can often assist in trying to, bolster your contract amount, is that you want to pay your people a little bit more. Those city agreements with their employees get a cost of living, increase of 1 to 2% every year. You didn't ask for that the last 3 years, but we're going to ask for it this year. And so just there are all kinds of analogies that you can use to how your local government is operating currently, and use those as negotiating points. And so, it is hard. There's some sticker shock if you're going from a per animal model. And then oftentimes there's a little sticker shock when you're saying, hey, I know we've had this agreement for the last 8 years, but it's no longer covering the cost of housing these animals. And the other thing is, so many of us are offering pet support services, or offering outreach activities, intake diversion, whatever you want to call it, crisis boarding. There are so many other resources that our animal shelters are offering that really should be somewhat subsidized by the city. If you think about it, if your city is subsidizing your community homeless shelter in any way, then they should also be assisting with any kind of crisis boarding that your animal shelter is doing to keep those pets with their people. And so, if those programs are taking off and you're saying, hey, we're providing these owner surrender resources and intake diversion, it's costing us, $30,000 a year to provide this service. All we're asking for is to split that in half. We'll provide half, you provide half, give us $15,000 next year. We are doing this to keep animals out of the shelter and keep people in their homes. There are so many people, and you can point to all the data of folks who are not seeking housing, or they're prevented from seeking housing because of their pets, because they're not willing to part with their pets. And you use that to say, we are a part of this chain. We are all working together for this. And we need a little bit of money for that. If we want to keep this operation running smoothly, and we want to keep our community happy, and we want to keep families housed. So those are just a few more things that you can ask for, or negotiating points. And the other thing is talking about how the services that you offer affect public health and safety. That is so critical to that. First, that's what the city is interested in anyway. And just relate what you're offering, the enhanced services you're offering compared to last year, or the last 8 years, or the last 3 years, to what you're offering now, and how that impacts public safety. One, you're doing intake diversion, you're keeping animals with their people, and all of those things are happening because you're trying to keep animals off the street and animals from coming into your shelter. And when you start talking about it in a public health and safety realm, then they tend to perk up a little bit. The cities tend to perk up a little bit. Kate, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, just go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to go back to our 2 model cities. And when I said earlier that it can be risky to negotiate a flat rate fee, you got to take in mind that like all of this is politics. And for example, in Dogville, the board chair is best friends with the mayor, and the shelters had the same leadership for years. So they were actually able to negotiate a much better contract. Whereas in Cat City, the municipal funding for the shelter is under the police department. The police department has to reduce its budget by 15% next year. So you need to have good situational awareness of the relationships and how things are functioning, particularly in the municipality, because, we think politics in the animal welfare world is bad. It's 1,000 times worse in municipal governments. And sometimes the smaller the government, the worse it is. So this one, when Katie and I did this presentation the first time, I spent a lot of time looking at different models. And this was the model that I was like, I love this model, because this is how a lot of funding happens for a lot of human services that happen in communities. And not even just human services, but waste management and all of these things. And so it's a language they speak. So they already speak this language. And the other piece that I love about it is that it wraps in all of the services you provide. It's not tied to the number of animals that come into the shelter, because if we're doing our jobs right and providing all of these wraparound services to keep pets in homes and to keep them healthy, then yeah, our shelter intake should start to go down. But we don't want that to be a signal to our municipality that therefore they need to fund us less. So by doing this, you're creating a model that's about, this is what it costs to provide the services in our community on a per capita basis. And it helps us ensure that the funding matches the needs based on the number of humans who live there. So the national rate, when I looked last year, was $10.22 per person. Now I know, Katie, you probably have some stuff to say about this, because I think you've been doing a lot of this work recently, and I'm really excited to hear about it.
Yeah, so this is once again, if once you get the municipality to understand, as Kate said, that this is a service, this is a community service that does affect the health, safety, and welfare of the community, then and you attach it to, this is just what you would ask for people to pay. It's this, each person to pay a little bit toward your animal shelter, and talk to them about the population. The population is growing. It's also a really great one to use because you can anticipate the escalation rate of your annual terms of your contract, because the city, like Kate said, speaks this language already. So they are constantly, doing population models for population growth to figure out infrastructure, budget allocation. And so you're just asking to be kind of wrapped up into that. And I have to say, in the Midwest, the per capita rate is more like $5 to $8. But it's a pretty good one to say, hey, you can figure this out with your own budget that you have now, and say, this is what it's costing. The national rate is anywhere from 5 to 10. Are we at 2 or are we at 20? But from what Kate and I have found over the last 2 years that we've been doing this, it's between $5 and $10. And that's just for sheltering services. Now, some animal shelters are, of course, offering field services or animal control services now. That goes up pretty significantly. It almost doubles per capita. And so you just explain that to them. But man, I tell you, it has been, once we kind of get everyone on board, it is so easy to negotiate this contract. So I like this. This is my favorite one to negotiate. And we'll see how it goes over the next handful of years. But this is a very exciting model. Okay, Kate.
So we go back to our city and we see now that if we switch to a per capita model with slightly higher rates for Dogville than Cat City, we've increased the amount of funds that can now be reallocated for new programs. We've got a larger percentage of the work that we're doing covered by the contract. And what that means is now we've got new programming that can help increase your live release rate, increase your abilities to make the world a better place. I will say there is another model that I'm not, and it's a model that I'm not going to talk about very much today, just because I don't have everything wrapped together, but I will talk about it because it is what we see here in DC. Is my organization does shelter services and field services for DC and has done so for more than 40 years. And we, up until not too long ago, we're actually doing that per animal rate, which is wild if you consider, how large our intake is. Secondarily, a few years ago, we were able to renegotiate a different type of contract, which is a positions funded contract. And so what our CFO was able to do was to assess, based on the work that the contract requires us to do, the number and types of positions that were needed to execute those functions. And then he added in a pretty hefty kind of overhead roundup like you would see in federal grants. It is it's a quite fair compensation model, but it is extremely administratively burdensome. And at the end of the day, I think we would achieve a better and easier outcome using a per capita model.
Yeah, and I'll have to say that I have had a couple clients, mainly in rural areas of the Midwest, who are coming from a positions funded model, or it's been proposed when they've asked for an increase. And just, as a super annoying lawyer, I have to say it's so risky to have a city funding positions without a very, very clear distinction of who's the supervisor, who are they employed by, and where do they report to, what are their metrics, who gets to hire and fire, all of those things. And so when some of you may have something like where your city is providing you a staff member at your shelter, so they work at your shelter, but they're funded by the city, and you can't do anything about it if they aren't achieving the outcomes that you are asking of them. And so that I would never advise that. But when you're just talking about what Kate said about, just saying, hey, this is how many employees it takes to run this operation, this is what it's going to cost to fund those positions. And then that's it. And the city doesn't feel like there's any kind of obligation, or that these employees are under them, then that's okay. But, yeah, that's my little comment on that. So Kate, take us through these case studies that are based on real shelters, and real budgets, real contracts.
Yes, these are all based on real shelters that we looked at to kind of say, if we could get the information, which we could, we looked at 2 different types of rural shelters, a couple of different mid-size shelters, a large municipal facility, and then one that does shelter and field. And so you can see across the board that for every single one of them, like I guess what I'll say is, like, if we look at rural shelter A, they are funded per animal. Their overall budget is, $250,000. 16% is covered by the contract, and then their per capita funding is $50. So, but you can also see that, this is a very small shelter taking in 400 animals. I guess maybe they don't have a hard time raising the extra funds to make sure that they have a high live release rate. And then you can go all the way up to rural shelter B, which has a flat rate fee. Almost all of their budget is covered by the contract, and that works out to, that $7.40 per capita. So you really want to look at, what your community looks like, what your shelter intakes look like, and what model is going to be the best. But I still think probably at the end of the day, you really either need to go for a flat rate or a per capita model. It's easier for everybody. And it also really establishes that you are a vendor providing a service. When your municipalities are negotiating with electric companies and things like that, they're not telling them what they're going to pay. The electric company is telling them, this is our rate. You might do some negotiating up and down, but it's not this sort of poverty model that we've sort of allowed ourselves to fall into in the nonprofit world.
Yeah, I would just have to agree with that. And I know it's easy for me because I'm not running the shelter. But so often we undervalue ourselves and our services that we provide without looking at the actual logistics and the big picture of what it's going to take for your shelter or your city to take over sheltering services. In my 12 years of doing this, I have only seen that happen one time. And all the other times folks are saying, okay, if you don't want to fund us, then we're either going to reduce services or find your own shelter. Well, they don't want to find their own shelter. half the time they come up with, they'll find a way to meet you halfway on what you're asking. They don't want the burden of trying to figure this out themselves. They have you, you're doing a great job, you're successful. And they want to continue that success because that success reflects on them. Their community, animal issues are important to a community. I don't know if you have realized that by now, but anytime that an animal issue comes up, whether it has to do with animal sheltering or otherwise, it is constantly at the forefront. That is when City Hall is packed. It always is in any jurisdiction I've ever worked in, whether we're talking about community cats or BSL or a contract renewal or, a city trying to cut one of my clients' funding. People turn out. Your community, if you're doing a good job in your community supports you, and animal issues are important to them. And the city does not want to have to deal with that. So, I hope, we have a few more slides, but I hope at the end of this that you all understand the value that you provide and the impact you have in your community, and that you really could use that to your advantage in negotiating contracts. Kate?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. So the shelter that I ran most recently, Humane Society of Vero Beach in Southeast Florida, and we were coming up on a contract renewal. Right, I got there in 2019, and as you can see, we had a very low live release rate. We had a per animal flat rate fee of $75, and less than 7% of our shelter budget was covered by the contract. And as we were coming up to the contract renewal, one of the biggest challenges that I had, because we had the housing contract, but we did not operate field services. And so community cats was a really big issue in our community because it was illegal. TNR was illegal. And so our field services in our community spent all of their time rounding up unsocial cats, bringing them to the shelter to hold them for 3 days and then euthanize them. And I was not okay with that. And so we went through a negotiation process about, what we could and couldn't do. And we could not come together and agree on it. And Katie's right. You start having public meetings about community cats and everybody and their brother shows up. And so we ultimately told our county that we did not want the contract anymore. And we gave them notice. I think, Katie, do you remember we gave them 9 months notice? Something
I
like
think it was
that.
shorter than that, just a few months.
Yeah, you're probably right. And so they actually went through the activity of trying to identify, an old warehouse on Route 1 out in the middle of nowhere where they thought they could retrofit it. They decided they could probably run the shelter for about $1 million a year. They were sure they could get a part-time vet for, was it $45,000? I mean, it was a ridiculous sort of act that they went through until they really were like, no, this isn't going to work. And so we went from there to a flat rate fee. The slide that we were talking about the flat rate fee, where it said we calculated the amount, it's this amount, and we're going to generously give you a discount. We built that in because it was a sticker shock for the county. Before I left, we actually renegotiated a new contract that had an increase built in for the next 3 years, and obviously growing very quickly.
Yeah. So then let's go through, and then there are also some additional, I would say don't shy away from getting creative with your agreement as well. Kate, this is something I believe that you negotiated in, is that correct? Or you found in another agreement?
This was another shelter that I was familiar with, but they actually built in some stuff into the contract that really helped them with operating costs that were endemic in the area. In South Florida, you've got a lot of heartworm. And so they were able to negotiate, kind of additional things. And you can try that. I mean, you can try that. And Nancy, you asked a good question, but now it just disappeared. But Katie, I think it's a question for you.
I have like so many screens going right now. Oh, how do we feel about adding terms or situations that would prompt contract reopeners? Yeah, that would be, I don't mind that. And, you know, we'll talk about actually some terms right now. So this is a good one, kind of, Nancy, to your point. This is really good language, because inevitably you all know that when your contract term comes up, the city is always like, oops, I never knew that that was happening. And can we just do what we did last year? And when you finally take a stance and say, hey, I want to change the terms, I want to either change what the services we offer to you, or, you know, we want more money, or we're going to reduce our services, then there's a lot of back and forth, and that can last for months. I'm sure some of you know. And so this renewal gap term is really important to have in there. So like, we'll continue to provide the service, you'll continue to pay us until we get like this money thing worked out. And that could be like if in fact our current intake is from the city is 30% of the population, or 30% of intake comes from this jurisdiction. And if at any point 60% starts to come in, that prompts a renegotiation of this contract. Like, you could put that in there, but that burden almost always falls on you to be keeping track of that data. And so that would be the only thing I would warn you about. And then there would be a lot of language to add in there later. But renewal gap, and then also this I have found is critical. This, when animals are involved in a bite attack or otherwise injurious incident, dropped off at the shelter, this is what happens. And this happens also with owners who are in custody, or owners who or there may be a neglect or cruelty case that they're investigating. Animal control inevitably comes to your shelter, they drop off an animal, and they're like, you may not release this animal. Well, for what? You know, for what reason? Who's the owner? How can we get in touch with the owner and say, hey, do you want to surrender this animal? Or hey, can we provide you with a resource? Or hey, when is your court date for this dog bite? If you're not heavily involved in your municipal court and communicating regularly with your municipal prosecutor, you have no idea how long you're holding that dangerous dog. You may have one where your municipal animal control drops off the dog and is like, this is a neglect case we're investigating, and then they never come back. They never tell you how the investigation is going. So this language, you always want to say, who is the enforcement officer? When did this event occur? The names who may be witnesses, they may not release that to you. The circumstances surrounding it, so your shelter is informed on how to handle this animal. Putting the burden on animal control to give you all the information you need on when you can dispose of the animal by adoption, transfer, euthanasia, whatever it is, helps your population, helps move along your population. I have a client who I think is on a call right now. It's very exciting. And we have weekly meetings. I have weekly meetings with almost all my clients, but we have weekly meetings about neglect cases and bite cases, and we want to keep those animals moving. And if you don't have this information from the city who's bringing you the animals, then it makes the disposition of animals in your shelter very problematic, especially when everyone is so overcrowded. The other language that I always have in an agreement is the third one here, which is the parties agree and acknowledge that the rescue or shelter is performing a traditional government function that is authorized by whatever your local government is that you're contracting with, pursuant to the respective ordinances, because that will, in most states, and you know, you would definitely need to contact an attorney in your state, but in most states that would allow you to assert, or you could use this at least as evidence for any liability, as having sovereign immunity, which is like qualified immunity for any kind of litigation that would come up for any action that you've taken. And then also, in case that you've had some problems with your Department of Agriculture, your inspecting state agency, you want to say that any animals presented as strays that may be an issue in your shelter can be fostered. And then animals could also be that are assumed to be pregnant may also be sent into foster care. Forfeiture of animals, almost every state, I think every state now has pre-conviction forfeiture. You want to make sure that you're able to talk to an attorney, or you have someone on staff, or you have a good relationship with your district attorney or state prosecutor, that you have this pre-conviction forfeiture, which means you can move for disposition of an animal before the investigation or before the case is over with, before the animals are disposed of by the criminal case. And then considerations for funding with impounded animals. Like if you need extra care, that either the county is going to pay for that, or that you'll pay for it, and that you can invoice it on top of the other actions or other services that you provide. Bad language. I think you guys are probably familiar with bad language. You may have some in your agreement right now. But I've seen some of this really bad stuff, like the shelter agrees to continue to make efforts to raise private donations, like the city's obligating you to fundraise outside of what you are receiving from the city. And of course, always we have this animal shelter is required to accept all animals. We don't want that. And you absolutely do not want to have adoption fees in your contract. Those are oftentimes in the city code, which you don't want them in your city code either, because you want some flexibility. You should always have flexibility to raise the adoption fee depending on the, age of the animal, as you know, or to waive or reduce adoptions. And then the really bad stuff is when your county or city wants a seat on your board, or that they want to require you to stick to your line item budgets. If you present them with a budget and you're saying animal care, including food and veterinary care, is $10,000 a year, and then like capital improvements or something are $5,000 a year, and then you want to move some money over because you are having a wonderful surplus in one category, and you want to move it to another category. You don't want your city or county to say you can't do that. So that's some bad stuff. And then knowing your worth, you guys know, experience and success. You want to definitely show your county or city how you're successful. How are you successful regionally and nationally? And then what happens if you underbid your agreement? And then arguing for the value you serve in the community. It's intangible, but give them your metrics, compare them to other similarly situated cities. That's really, really good to do, especially if you're surrounded by moderately funded animal shelters with similar populations. And you can look in your region. You don't have to stick to your state. What does your city like to look to when they're building infrastructure, when they're creating ordinances? One of my cities that I work with often, they love to look at Ann Arbor, Michigan for some reason. And so they look at that for creating their ordinances, and what's Ann Arbor doing with housing and stuff like that. And if you can find out what your city, the other cities your city likes to look at, reach out to the local shelter and say, hey, what does your shelter agreement look like? Are they also doing a good job with sheltering? And then bring that into the city and explain that to them. Kate, what else do you have?
I actually think that last point is a really important one, because I feel like every municipality has a competitor that they want to be. And I've had a lot of really good luck with looking at similar, and you can look at similar, communities, demographics, all of that.
Oh, I think we're done.
Thank you both so much. Claire, you gonna close us out, my friend?
Yes, thank you. I know there's this was a ton of great information, and we could probably spend a lot more time on this topic. There's a lot of questions that came up in the chat, but I have copied them, and I'm going to put them or work with the Maddie's team to make sure those go up on the Maddie's Pet Forum, so we can keep that conversation going. And I know Katie and Kate will be able to chime in there, but appreciate you both so much. Thank you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday and new year. We'll see you in the new year on January 8th. So thanks so much for being here. Appreciate you all. Have a great week.